So I recently was talking to somebody about this concept that I thought my listeners might want to hear about. So have you ever found yourself, let's say, in an argument with someone? Maybe it's a coworker at work, and you just are really upset with this person. Maybe even a little bit more upset with them than you would expect, or maybe that other people would expect, given the context of what's going on in your situation with them. And you just can't figure out why it is that you're having such a big response to them. Maybe you're even seeing similarities between this person that you're having an argument with and other people from your life, or maybe from your past. Is that something that you've experienced before? Because if you have, let me just tell you, you are not alone, my friend. There is a scientific reason that this is happening to you, and I'm going to teach you about that today. So keep listening.
Welcome. This is how to fix your sucky life. That's right. Maybe you're somebody who says, "So life sucks. Now what?" Right? Fix me, doc. I don't know what to do with all of this. This is a podcast that teaches anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about how to get control of the anxiety in their life, the stress in their life, all of those feelings that are bogging you down. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Marr, a clinical psychologist of the last 2 decades and a trauma therapist. And I'm here to help you understand how things early in our life, things like trauma or really difficult times, impact us later in life. So much so that it drives us off course and into patterns that are not helping us. They don't serve us, and they create suffering for us. And there's a lot of information swimming out there. So I know that people are looking to feel better and want to know what works. Why don't we help you fix that sucky life? I take all of the information from neuroscience, my experience over the last 2 decades, and all the fits and starts of my own personal life, and I put it all together in a toolbox for you so that you can stop just surviving and learn how to really thrive in your life. I know it's possible to get there, so let's get started.
Welcome back, everybody, to Life Sucks. Now what, huh? And definitely life sucks when we get caught in arguments and feel like we're having all of this big emotion around it. And yet we can't really put our finger on it, but it maybe, if we're being honest with ourselves, is bigger. Like our reaction is a little bigger than we would expect it to be given the context of the situation. So let me tell you a little bit about how this podcast came to be, why I decided to talk to you about this today. So I was having a conversation actually with a friend of mine, and she was having this huge problem at work with a very dismissive supervisor. Just wasn't like hearing all the parts of what they were saying, what my friend was saying, wasn't, taking into consideration some of the ramifications of their dismissiveness and their indecisiveness around a decision that impacted this friend of mine. And so this friend kept getting more and more and more angry. Now, this friend also happens to be somebody who has recently gone through something very significant and has a really difficult relationship with a family member around that difficult situation. And some of the aspects of what was happening with this supervisor just mimicked enough what I know to be true about what has happened with her in the past with this other family member of theirs. So I said, listen, I'm just wondering, are you seeing similarities in this supervisor to this other person in your life? And they were like, yeah, of course. They're like the same person. And I was like, slow your roll, talk to your therapist, because I think there's more going on there. And of course, that's always where I stop with a friend, is I would refer them to talk to their own therapist. But I want to talk with my listeners here today about what is really going on in that situation, because I think we all can empathize with this. Like, this is a situation all of us have seen go down in our life. Well, what I'm going to tell you is probably not going to be a surprise, but what's happening in those moments is emotionally you're having a reaction that is consistent with what you've learned before. And you've learned it in painful circumstances with other people. But there's something about this individual that you're interacting with presently that that's kind of warning signs or red flags. And whether you're consciously aware of this or not really doesn't matter. Your body mind is picking up on that. And when your body mind is picking up on that, it's reacting in this very, big emotional way as if it was the original offender of these things, right? You may even find that you're projecting, is what we call this in psychology, but you're kind of thinking that other person is thinking and feeling and doing things in such a way as the person that's done this to you before. And that may or may not be true. I mean, there could totally be similarities. This supervisor being dismissive clearly was no good for my friend. And the things that my friend was starting to think that the supervisor was thinking and plotting and doing were way more consistent with stuff that she had experienced with this other family member, not necessarily the history that she had with the supervisor, but because this situation was happening in such close time proximity to, with her supervisor to when this stuff had gone down with this family member, it made a ton of sense that her body mind was having this reaction. Well, why do we do this, right? What is the point of this, Dr. Natalie? Well, there is an evolutionary reason for this. Our body and mind, our brain, it's like a supercomputer for picking up patterns in our environment. And the reason for this is that it really wants to simplify your life. It wants to be able to make decisions in the split second that are best going to meet the needs of you as an organism out in the world. And so when it's gone through an experience, especially that was very difficult, challenging, took a lot for you to get there. Well, in those circumstances, it really imprints quite firmly into your brain a blueprint of this, first few signs of dismissiveness means it's going to turn into this. And we're going to have all of our reactions come up automatically as a result of that. Whatever that original insult was kind of maps out what your reaction is going to be. And the more difficult or traumatic that the situation originally was, or situations, right? Because there could be this is a learned pattern of, somebody in my friend's life that was dismissive all of their life from their family. It wasn't, there were some recent incidents with that individual, but this is somebody who had been chronically that way, right? So it doesn't just mean one occurrence, but could be, piled up cumulative occurrences of that kind of experience. Well, her brain mapped out a response of how to protect herself and how to take care of herself in those situations. And getting very emotional was a part of that, and taking up space in her life and being angry about it. Now, here's the tricky part though. If our body mind is pre-programmed to kind of see some of those initial things that this supervisor was doing and then have this reaction, as in the case of my friend, what's one to do when the situation at hand really doesn't call for all that, right? And what kind of messes can we get ourselves into when we're reacting in that big way? Well, that was really what I was noticing for my friend, why I encouraged her to talk to her therapist about this, because truly, truly, I think, many, many times, I can't put a percentage on it, but gosh, it's more than 50-50. I can tell you that. It's way more in the neighborhood of maybe 70. Many, many times our reactions in the moment in, negative contexts, like when there's conflict with other people, that we're coming from a space where parts of us unconsciously are showing up in those situations based on pre-existing experience. And we may be reacting in that scenario in a way that's way bigger than we need to be, or way off, honestly, and could get us into more conflict later on down the line. So we have to be careful when we start to notice ourselves having big reactions emotively, especially in conflict with other people, that we haven't actually, been drawing from an imprint of an earlier experience or experiences. Now, how do you stop this? That's really the question that I'll get. So, life sucks, now what, right, Doc? So, okay, you can go with me. Earlier experiences in our life teach our body mind to have a recognition of that pattern, or assumption, probably a better word, an assumption of that pattern when we start to see things in our real day-to-day life that look a little like that. And then we start to have our programmed response to that we've always had. Now, by the way, it doesn't mean big emotions are the only reaction in a situation like that. Conflict for a lot of people can bring up something like people pleasing, that you learned from a young age with big, high conflict people in your life to ameliorate that right away. Ooh, got to people please, got to take care of them, got to get this conflict away. And you're very conflict avoidant, or just to avoid it altogether, avoid those people altogether. And the real discomfort is showing up when life circumstance doesn't let you escape it. It's a spouse, it's a supervisor, it's a coworker, it's somebody that you can't get away from, a sibling, a child, those kinds of things. The other people, will avoid them, right? But the people that we can't avoid, then we have to create some other way to distance ourselves from that conflict. And so people pleasing, which is kind of a response of trying to overly anticipate when other people are going to be upset or have conflict and overly prevent that. They tend to be worriers and overthinkers on top of, in the moment, people pleasing and taking care of other people's needs and denying their own needs. Those are the cornerstones of that people pleasing behavior. So it could be that big response, right? But a pre-programmed one based on earlier relationships in life. So let's play this out a little bit. Let's say you are my friend and this does start to happen at work. And anytime you're being dismissed, you're getting activated and angry and uncomfortable. And then you show up maybe defensively with your supervisor or coworker. And then that supervisor or coworker gets bigger and they show up more defensively and they're on top of you about, no, this is the way this project is supposed to go. And so there is like a critical mass point, and then you kind of dovetail into people pleasing because you're trying to get this conflict away from you and you can't quit the job and you can't avoid them at the job. And so you're going to have to find another way to create what you think is peace, right? But in actuality, what's happening is you're using up a lot of mental energy, worrying about it, trying to prevent it from happening, trying to ameliorate it and people please it away when it does happen. And all of this psychic energy is getting spent on a pre-programmed response that is assuming that this person is like the pattern you've recognized in the past, when in actuality, they may not be. There may be other solutions. There may be other ways to do conflict resolution in those spaces, right? So if this is how it's playing out in your life, what are you going to do with that, right? We can't unprogram ourselves. Our body mind is going to do that. So one of the things that I teach clients, and this is both in my coaching business and in my clinical therapy business, and now you, my listeners, I teach people that what you want to think about is the rumble strips on the side of a highway, right? Those bumpy sides before you go off into a ditch. So if for whatever reason you start to fall asleep or you get distracted and you go out of a lane, it starts to go and vibrate the whole car. And then you're like, oh my gosh, got to get back on the road. Think of the road as you want to have a new way of approaching things, not go into your old programming, right? Not go into the old having big emotional responses, over interpreting and projecting that this person is doing something to you that's very similar to what you've experienced in the past. And so ergo, they must be going to go down like it has in the past. And I need to gear up for that. When that gets activated, think of that as the rumble strip back to the old way of doing things. And you don't want to go off in that ditch. You want to get back on the new road, and your new road is you showing up to this a little bit differently. Now, some of us will have, relatively not easy time, but like once we get the hang of, oh, this is a rumble strip. That's an old way. I don't want to overinterpret that my, peer is being a jerk and dismissive for this reason. I want to, think that they're doing something. Maybe they're coming from a bad day, maybe they've had some stressors in their life. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And that allows me to back off and not take this personally and just come at it from, here are the things I can do, setting limits. Here are the things I won't do with you. You're my peer. Like, this is my job. This is your job description. Hey, let's try to help each other out here. I'm here to be your support, but I'm not going to take that on personally the way that you're coming at me. So you're able to show up to it differently. For some of us, that's, a relatively easy transition once we start to build the self-awareness that is that rumble strip, once we start to feel ourselves go in to that area. But self-awareness skills take some doing. I teach mindfulness always as the precursor to building up the parts of the brain. And I've had these, discussions with you in the podcast earlier. So please go back to earlier podcasts when mindfulness was brought up. But a little lesson here. If you're looking at your brain being your fist, those of you who are not watching this on YouTube, just listen to me. Like if you close your fist around your thumb, right? So your 4 fingers go around your thumb and you're coming at me with those 4 fingers, right? Think of those 4 fingers on top, from the knuckle to the hand. Think of that as your frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is right behind your forehead. And right behind your forehead is all of this stuff in our brain that allows us to think things through, to problem solve, to recognize rumble strips, have self-awareness, bring ourselves back on track. Even though our body might be having a reaction, to override that reaction and say, listen, I'm not dying. I'm not threatened. This is not something I need to take personally, right? We want to have access to that part of our brain. The problem is those pre-programmed responses that we talked about earlier in this podcast, those come from other areas of the brain that aren't attached necessarily to that conscious awareness. And so self-awareness building and mindfulness building is a way to bridge back to that frontal lobe. It's back, engaging the part of us that knows something different and can override emotionally driven, behaviorally driven, just habitually driven responses that our body mind has as patterns of behavior. So if that's, rumble strip has, ditch has become a habit and you need to get out of that habit and you need to recognize rumble strip, which is that habit as it starts to be, come as you start to have that big emotional response, see yourself people pleasing, doing whatever it is that you do in those situations. Well, you need that frontal lobe to be online. And the way to build the bridge between the parts of the brain that are doing this automaticity of just acting out of programming of what you've known to do forever and seeing it differently and going on the new road, or getting back on the new road that you want to get on. Well, you're going to have to build that up with mindfulness practice. It's just being in the here and now, focusing on one thing. And remember, I'll just do a little lesson here. Remember that mindfulness isn't being a Buddhist monk that has cleared their mind of everything and staying in that state for a long period of time. Like, power to you if you can get there. Power to you. Most of us, our mind wanders hundreds of times in a time that we sit down for mindfulness. And that's okay, because to me, that's the opportunity for repetition of let's lift a weight up and direct my attention back to whatever that mindfulness practice is, right? Mind wanders, bring it back to the practice. Mind wanders, bring it back to the practice. And that's like repeating reps, right, of a weight that you're lifting up and down and up and down, and you're building the strength of a muscle, which is neurology between those parts of your brain that automatically have you responding and recognize a pattern and don't even tell you, and the parts of your brain that are aware and online and can see that as a rumble strip. So you got to practice some mindfulness. That's the first part of this. You got to build the strength of the brain to be able to do this. Once you've got that under control and you start to notice it, there'll be a period of discomfort. I'm sorry, friends, but there will, where you'll notice that you do the old pattern and you're watching yourself do it, but can't stop it. This is a natural part of the change process. Think about it. If you want to change something and you don't know what it is, you just know that you don't like the outcome of it, but you don't have any idea of what the nuts and bolts are of how to do it, how are you going to change it? Right? If you like chocolate chip cookies, but you keep baking cookies that are sugar cookies and you don't know what the ingredients are that go in and you haven't watched yourself do the baking and you don't see how many minutes it takes and what mixes in and what ingredients versus dry ingredients, any of that stuff, right? How are you ever going to turn it around into something else? You can't, right? So there's first mindfulness and having the access to the frontal lobe that can see the world differently and choose differently for yourself. And then there is the sheer just time of watching yourself hit that rumble strip, go in the ditch, hit that rumble strip, go in the ditch, and do the old behavior till you really are familiar with all the ingredients and all the steps that go into it. so that you could interrupt that and bring yourself back on to the highway, which leads to the third step, which is interruption. You've got to interfere with that pattern. You've got to interrupt that pattern. So recognizing a rumble strip is kind of a pattern interrupt, but even more so, you need to bulk that up, add something to it. So, for my example that I've talked about on this podcast, it was, if my friend had known it was a rumble strip that she was having an emotive response to this person at work that was very similar to a family member of hers, then maybe that friend would have been able to get up from her desk, take a walk for 20 minutes on her break, come back and reset. It's an interruption. She's not staying at the desk. She's not rereading emails. She's not doing that. She's interrupting. She's letting go of it all. She's resetting her nervous system, because a walk is a really great way to just regulate and get yourself from that triggered state of being back into that thriving, living state of being. So that's your third step. Recognize it, mindfulness. We got to practice, have those self-awareness skills. Then we have to be able to, connect that to the incident that's happening and watch it over and over enough times that we really know it. That's the second step. And then the third step is we got to pattern interrupt once we've recognized those rumble strips. And of course, the last step is choose something different. Usually the next question I get is, Dr. Natalie, what the heck am I supposed to choose different? And here is where I have the most unpopular answer, but it is absolutely the truth and nothing but the truth. You try something. There is no magical, this is what you should do instead. There's no rights and not rights that any psychologist on this earth can just write out for you. Clearly, there are some maladaptive behaviors, but I promise you, if you've got a brain in that skull, you already know what those are. Really, you do. And what I want you to do is trust that you have good judgment. And so based on what you know right now, what would be a better way to act in those moments? Try it. Try it for a while. Again, watch yourself do it. Is this a new ditch on the other side of the road, or is this helping you get on that new road? You got to watch yourself for a while before you know that. Once you know better, do better. If this isn't working either, the new thing that you chose, choose something different, right? So for my friend who was having this big emotional response and being very defensive, and noticing like all of those responses that were familiar from family, like they went back, they talked to their therapist, and they came up with some ideas of new things to do for themselves. So they're watching themselves get caught up in it sometimes, but when they can do a pattern interruption, then they can show up to it a little bit differently. And then they practice that for a while until they see if that works. So it's really 4 steps, right? Mindfulness to build the strength in the brain to have self-awareness. Starting to have self-awareness at a very detailed level, which means watching yourself repeat the automaticity of falling into those old habits over and over till you're familiar enough with it to know, ooh, that's where I should do something different. Then pattern interrupt anytime you hit that rumble strip on the side of the highway so that it brings you back to the new road. And then try that new thing on your new road and see how that goes for you. Rinse, repeat those 4 steps and you're good to go, my friends. So just thought I'd bring this to your attention because this is something that comes up quite often. And I know that I talked about it in the context of something that's interpersonal, but this is even true of things that we do for ourselves or don't do for ourselves, like when we're very neglectful of our own self-care. That's an automatic pattern. Somewhere along the line, you learned that. That's your roadmap. And you need to get more self-awareness of that. You need to be able to really get familiar with it at a deep level so that you might pattern interrupt it and do something different in your life. So I hope that this helps you with this part of your life that might be sucking. So now you know what to do.
Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I need to be sure that you understand this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and it is not a replacement for any mental health or medical therapy, counseling, or other treatments. I also want to be sure that if you are in crisis, that you seek out help. So I'm going to share with you here 2 different resources that you might use for yourself or someone else you know that's close to you in crisis. The first is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can find them at suicidepreventionlifeline.org online, or pick up the phone and dial 988. and you can talk to somebody right away if you're in crisis. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't like to pick up the phone to talk to somebody directly, there is also a crisis text line. You can find them at crisistextline.org online, or you can text HOME to 741-741, and you'll reach somebody right away to help you in crisis. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and I strongly encourage that you like and follow us wherever you find your podcasts. Share us if you like an episode and think somebody could use that information, and certainly leave a review if you feel like there's something that really resonated for you. It helps me when I see those reviews to make sure to have relevant material on the podcast that you want to hear about.